I never thought this day would come. After 17 years of dedicating my life to engineering, pouring in every ounce of my skill, every late night, every complicated project, I got called into my boss's office. I walked in expecting maybe a routine update or a discussion about an upcoming project, but what I didn't expect was the words that would hit me like a punch to the gut. You're too expensive. We're letting you go. 17 years. 17 years of loyalty, of expertise, of building systems that kept the company running smoothly, and it all came down to a single word: expensive. I sat there in silence, trying to process what I had just heard. My mind was racing. How could they just throw away years of hard work like it meant nothing? How could someone who had dedicated almost 2 decades to a company be deemed too costly? The irony wasn't lost on me. Just a few months ago, I was praised for my leadership on a major project, commended for solving problems that no one else could. And now, suddenly, I was a liability. The walls of that office seemed to close in as my boss continued talking, his words like a soundtrack to a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I wanted to argue, to remind him of every late night, every crisis I had prevented, but somehow the words stuck in my throat. Walking out of that office, my heart was heavy, but I wasn't defeated, at least not yet. I knew my worth, and I knew the value of what I could offer. What I didn't know was how quickly the tables would turn. Just weeks after being shown the door, I started hearing rumors that the company was struggling with problems only I could solve. My inbox began filling with messages from my former colleagues, subtle at first, asking for advice, checking in. Then the messages became more direct, more desperate. And finally it came. The call I never expected. My former boss, the same person who had told me I was too expensive, begging me for help. I remember staring at my phone in disbelief. The irony was almost too much to bear. After 17 years of commitment, after being cast aside, suddenly they needed me. And not just in a casual, can you lend a hand, way, but in a way that could make or break the company. Every memory of being undervalued came flooding back, and I couldn't decide whether to feel anger, satisfaction, or just sheer disbelief. As I sat there thinking, I realized this wasn't just a story about being fired. It was about loyalty, about recognition, about standing up for yourself, and about the strange twists of fate that life throws at you. The people I trusted, the projects I poured myself into, suddenly all came back knocking on my door, but this time on my terms. The real question now isn't whether I'll help them, it's whether I should. After years of dedication, after being discarded like an old tool, how do you respond when the very people who let you go are begging for your expertise? The tension was unbearable, the stakes higher than ever. Every decision I make now could change everything, not just for me, but for the company I helped build. And that's where my story begins, on the edge of a decision that could either be my comeback or my final closure. What would you do if the very people who told you you weren't worth it suddenly needed you more than ever? Stay with me, because what happened next was something I never could have predicted. After that call, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying it in my mind. My former boss, the same person who had made me feel worthless after 17 years, now sounding almost desperate, almost pleading. I wondered if this was a trick, some kind of manipulation, or if the company was really in trouble. Either way, my curiosity was piqued. I had given so much to this place, and now life was giving me a strange twist, a chance to see how it all really looked from the other side. The next morning, I decided to go back, not as an employee, not as someone seeking approval, but as an observer, someone who could see the truth for myself. I drove past the familiar streets, the same route I had taken countless times over the years. The office building loomed in front of me, just like it always had, but now it looked different. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was a place of memories, of late nights, of victories that no one outside of those walls would ever understand. And now, it was a place where my absence had created ripples, subtle but unmistakable. I met with a few former colleagues first, people I had worked closely with for years. The initial conversations were cautious, almost awkward. They didn't want to admit how badly things were going, and I didn't want to push. But then the story started coming out in bits and pieces. Projects that were stalling, errors that had gone unnoticed, deadlines that had been missed. All of it pointed to one thing. The company was struggling, and the solutions they needed, solutions only I could provide, were out of reach without me. It was strange to hear them speak about me in the past tense, as if I were a resource from history rather than a living, breathing problem solver who had just been dismissed. "We really could have used you on the Thompson project," one colleague said, almost whispering it, as if saying it out loud might be dangerous. "Things are messy without you." Their hesitation spoke volumes. The company's internal struggles were far deeper than I had imagined, and for the first time, I began to see just how much my absence had affected the day-to-day operations. But even as I listened, I felt a mix of emotions: anger, yes, but also a strange satisfaction. There was validation in their struggles, in knowing that my work had mattered, that my expertise had been essential. And yet, there was also caution. I didn't want to rush into anything. Being needed and being respected weren't the same thing, and I had learned that lesson the hard way. Later that day, I got a direct message from my former boss. He wanted to meet in person. Part of me wanted to ignore it. Part of me wanted to confront him, to ask exactly how he could justify what he had done. But curiosity, combined with a strange pull of unfinished business, made me agree. I arrived at a small coffee shop near the office, the place chosen not for privacy, but because it was neutral, a place where old hierarchies didn't matter. When he walked in, I barely recognized him. The confident, assured demeanor he had always carried was replaced by something else: hesitation, a flicker of fear, almost guilt. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, and I nodded, silently waiting for him to continue. He leaned in slightly and lowered his voice. "We made a mistake. We underestimated how much your work meant. Things are falling apart, and we need your help. Please." I studied him carefully. The man in front of me had made decisions that had upended my life. He had turned his back on me when it was convenient, dismissed my years of dedication in a single meeting, and now he was asking me to step in. There was a tension in his voice, almost like he was testing me, trying to see if I would forgive and forget. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I asked questions, carefully, deliberately. "What's happening exactly? Which projects are affected? How bad is it?" He hesitated, then started outlining the problems. Major systems that had once run smoothly were now malfunctioning. Deadlines were being missed. Internal communication had broken down. And worst of all, key clients were becoming frustrated, clients I had personally helped maintain for years. The story he told was troubling. The company wasn't just facing minor setbacks, they were at a tipping point, teetering on the edge of real consequences. And all of it had happened in the weeks since my departure. I realized that the company had taken for granted the invisible work I had done, the kind of problem-solving that doesn't make headlines but keeps everything running behind the scenes. And yet, even as he spoke, I could see the cracks in his own confidence. There was no arrogance left, no certainty. Instead, he seemed small, human, vulnerable in a way that the office walls had never revealed. It was a side of him I had never seen before, a reminder that even those in power are not infallible. After he left, I sat there for a long time, replaying the conversation in my head. Every instinct I had screamed caution. Helping him could mean walking back into a situation where I might be undervalued again. And yet, there was a part of me that couldn't ignore the challenge, the pull of unfinished work, the chance to prove to myself, and maybe to him, that my contributions mattered. Over the next few days, I dug deeper, quietly checking in with former team members, observing the systems I had helped build. The gaps were obvious. The company was struggling in ways that were painful to watch. But more than that, I began noticing something else. Opportunities. Opportunities to step in, to fix things, and to do it on my terms. There was a strange satisfaction in knowing that the power dynamics had shifted, even if the full story hadn't yet played out. At the same time, I couldn't ignore the personal toll. Being let go had shaken my confidence in ways I hadn't expected. Even now, weeks later, there were moments of doubt. Had I really been too expensive? Had I misjudged my value, or had they? The questions kept me awake at night, and the more I thought about them, the more complex the situation became. And then came the moment that would change everything, the first urgent call from my former boss. It was late in the evening, the kind of call that no one likes to get. I picked up, and his voice was shaky, almost panicked. We try to handle it without you, but it's getting worse." I don't know what to do. The weight of the situation hit me immediately. I realized that whatever decision I made next, it wouldn't just affect me. It could determine the fate of a company I had spent nearly 2 decades building, of colleagues I had trained, of clients who had trusted me. And yet, the choice was mine alone. I hung up the phone and sat in silence, staring at the ceiling. Anger, curiosity, pride, and caution all battled within me. The tension was unbearable. Should I step back in on my terms and help them navigate this crisis? Or should I walk away completely, letting them face the consequences of their own decisions? That night, I realized something crucial. This wasn't just a story about being fired, or even about being asked for help afterward. It was a story about power, about respect, about timing, and about understanding your own worth. It was a story about how life can turn on a single decision, and how every action, every choice, can ripple far beyond what you ever imagined. And as I sat there, weighing my options, I couldn't help but wonder, what would happen next? Would I be able to fix what had been broken, or had the damage gone too far? And most importantly, what did it really mean when the people who once dismissed you suddenly begged for your help? The answer wasn't clear, and the tension wasn't resolved. The stakes were higher than ever, and I was about to find out whether 17 years of experience were enough to turn the tide, or whether this was the moment where everything I had built could come crashing down. The next morning, I found myself back in my old office building, but this time, I wasn't an employee. I was a visitor, an observer, a ghost of my own past, walking through hallways that felt both familiar and strangely alien. The hum of computers, the clatter of keyboards, the murmur of colleagues, I noticed it all, but it felt quieter, like the life had been partially drained from the place. The energy that once drove innovation seemed dulled, hesitant, uncertain. I decided to start by talking to people directly involved in the projects that were now falling apart. First, there was Priya, a young engineer I had mentored for years. She greeted me cautiously, like someone unsure if I was a friend or a reminder of what they had lost. Her eyes betrayed her worry. "We tried, but it's just not working," she admitted quietly. "Some of the systems you designed, we don't fully understand the underlying logic, and it's causing more problems than solutions." Listening to her, I realized the depth of the gap. My departure hadn't just created a hole, it had exposed how dependent the company had become on my knowledge. There was no one else who could see the entire picture, anticipate the hidden challenges, or prevent cascading failures. And yet, this wasn't just about technical skill. It was about leadership, about the trust one had cultivated over 17 years. Without that foundation, even capable people struggled to make decisions. From there, I moved on to another team, the operations group that managed client communications. The tension here was different, more visible. Voices rose in frustration, deadlines were slipping, and small mistakes were stacking into larger problems. The team members were talented, but without guidance, their confidence wavered. I could see it in their expressions, the panic that comes when responsibility feels heavier than skill. Meanwhile, the rumors about my former boss's desperation were proving true. I overheard snippets of conversations, emails left open on screens, mentions of a failing client contract that could cost the company millions. The irony gnawed at me. I had been let go for being too expensive. Yet now, the cost of my absence was far higher. As I walked through these rooms, I couldn't ignore the human element, the people caught in the middle. They were loyal, hardworking, but lost. Many had looked up to me, not just for technical guidance, but for mentorship, for reassurance that their efforts mattered. Seeing them struggle without the support they needed was frustrating, almost heartbreaking. It made the stakes feel real, tangible. This wasn't just a corporate crisis. It was about people depending on one another and the fragile balance that held it all together. I spent the afternoon reviewing reports, emails, and system logs. Patterns emerged. Mistakes that were once caught early had gone unnoticed. Small inefficiencies had grown into major setbacks. And lurking behind all of it was a structural issue. Key decisions had been delayed or mishandled because no one had the full context, the comprehensive understanding of how everything interlocked. It became painfully clear my absence had exposed the weak points I had always quietly managed. But there was another layer to the conflict, one that wasn't as visible. Office politics, long dormant, were resurfacing. People who had quietly resented me over the years were now trying to assert themselves. Some subtly implied that my departure proved that anyone could be replaced. Others whispered doubts about whether I could really fix things if I came back. I felt the tension like a low current beneath the surface, a reminder that the corporate world is never just about projects or deadlines, but about egos, alliances, and unspoken rivalries. Then there was my former boss. He reached out again, asking for updates, asking for advice, almost nervously seeking my input without committing to any formal agreement. I could feel his discomfort in every word. He wanted results, fast, and he wanted them to appear as if he was still in control. But the truth was he wasn't, and that imbalance, the power shift, hung over me like a storm cloud, unpredictable and potentially explosive. In the middle of all this, I received an unexpected message from an old client, someone who had worked closely with me on major engineering projects. The tone was urgent, almost alarmed. They were seeing errors in the reports, delays in delivery, and inefficiencies that hadn't existed before. They asked if I could provide guidance, discreetly, without necessarily involving the company. I paused, reading the words again. The client trusted me more than they trusted my former employer. That trust was powerful, but it also complicated everything. If I helped externally, I could be seen as stepping around the company, but if I didn't, the consequences could be costly for people who had relied on my expertise. Walking through the building, I also noticed subtle signs of morale collapsing. Staff whispered about job security, about how management seemed confused, about how the direction they had once followed with clarity now felt murky. I realized the main conflict wasn't just about technology or deadlines. It was about confidence. The people who had believed in the company's stability were beginning to doubt it, and doubt spreads faster than any mistake in a system. Even outside the office, the tension followed me. Former colleagues reached out over messages, some apologizing for what had happened, some quietly asking if I would step in. The mix of emotions was dizzying: gratitude, guilt, desperation, hope, all rolled into one. It made me question my own motivations. Was I helping because I felt a sense of responsibility, or was it because seeing them struggle without me felt like a validation of my worth? Perhaps it was a little of both, but whatever the reason, the stakes were real, and the tension was escalating. By the end of the day, I realized something important. This conflict had layers. It wasn't just a personal story of being let go unfairly, nor was it simply a technical challenge. It was a complex mix of human emotion, corporate politics, systemic failures, and personal choices. Every decision I made in the coming days would affect careers, client relationships, and the very future of the company. And yet, even as I considered stepping in, part of me wanted to step back, to watch how the pieces fell without me. That night, I sat alone, thinking through the possibilities. Could I truly fix the problems? Could I navigate the delicate relationships, rebuild trust, and correct technical failures without being pulled back into the same cycle of undervaluation? Or would my involvement create new tensions, reignite old rivalries, and leave me in a position I didn't want to occupy? I knew one thing for certain: the situation was far from resolved. The conflict was deeper than anyone realized, and each move I made would ripple through the company in ways I couldn't yet predict. The tension wasn't just external, it was internal, within me, testing my judgment, patience, and resolve. And somewhere in that mix of frustration, opportunity, and human drama, the real question loomed: would I help them rise again, or would I let them face the consequences of their decisions alone? The next few days promised answers, but also more questions. As the sun set, I felt the weight of the coming choices, the uncertainty of the path ahead, and the undeniable pull of responsibility, and perhaps of revenge. And somewhere in that complex web of people, projects, and politics, I realized one thing: this story wasn't just about me, or even the company. It was about how fragile trust can be, how power can shift in an instant, and how one person can become both the problem and the solution. And even as I thought about the challenges ahead, I knew one thing for certain: nothing in the coming days would be simple, nothing would be predictable, and every decision I made could change everything. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Every morning, I found myself drawn back into the company's chaos, Not as an employee, not fully, but as someone hovering on the edge of control and influence. Problems that seemed small at first snowballed into crises. A minor miscalculation in one system had triggered delays in production. An overlooked error in client reports had set off complaints, some of them loud, some of them quietly urgent, all demanding immediate attention. And through it all, my former boss sent messages that were polite on the surface but desperate underneath, begging for solutions that only I could provide. I started spending long hours analyzing the problems, speaking with different teams, and walking through every process I had once designed. The irony was almost suffocating. The same company that had dismissed me for being too expensive now relied entirely on my expertise to stay afloat. And yet, there was a strange thrill in it, a sense that this was my moment, not just to prove my value, but to see the truth laid bare. The tension among the staff was palpable. People who had once been confident in their roles were now anxious, hesitant to make decisions without my guidance. I saw the subtle dynamics shift, colleagues whispering in corners, hesitant to act, wary of missteps. Even those who had quietly resented me before seemed to recognize, perhaps for the first time, the depth of my experience and the void my departure had created. Every glance, every question, every sigh of relief when I offered insight reminded me how crucial I had been. But the stakes weren't just internal. Clients began calling directly, frustrated and impatient. One key client, who had been with the company for years, demanded an urgent explanation for the delays. I could hear the tension in their voice as I spoke, and it struck me how much the company's reputation now hung on my shoulders. Each solution I suggested, each decision I guided, felt like walking a tightrope. One mistake, one misstep, and the consequences could be catastrophic. Then came the first truly alarming moment. A critical system, one I had spent months designing and fine-tuning over the years, failed completely. Alarms went off, and teams scrambled in confusion. I was called in immediately, and as I arrived, the scene was chaotic. Colleagues rushing, screens flashing red, people yelling over one another. I felt a familiar rush of adrenaline, the kind I had known countless times before when every second mattered. But this time, it wasn't just a technical challenge. It was a test of leadership, patience, and judgment. As I dug into the problem, I noticed something troubling. Errors that had never occurred before were appearing in the system. Patterns that should have been stable were now inconsistent. It was as if the system itself was rebelling against the lack of understanding and oversight that had replaced my guidance. My heart sank slightly, but I pushed it aside. Panic wouldn't help. Focus would. Every move had to be precise, deliberate, and controlled. While addressing the technical issues, I couldn't ignore the human conflict. My former boss hovered nearby, anxious, frustrated, almost pleading, but hesitant to make decisions without consulting me. There were moments when I could see the old arrogance slipping through the cracks, attempts to assert authority that faltered under pressure. And then there were colleagues looking at me, silently questioning why the company had ever let me go, and whether this moment would define not just my reputation, but the future of the team. Then came a series of calls from the clients. One after another, complaints poured in about errors, delays, and miscommunications. Some were polite, some were sharp, some hinted at consequences I didn't want to imagine. The tension escalated further. The company was now facing what I realized could be a major turning point, a point where decisions I made in the next hours could determine whether everything unraveled or held together. I began working almost nonstop, moving from one issue to another, trying to contain the chaos. I felt the pressure in every fiber of my body, but I also felt clarity in a way I hadn't for years. I knew the system intimately, knew the pitfalls, the hidden risks, the leverage points. And yet, even with all my experience, I couldn't ignore the human element, the fear, the hesitation, the politics, and the fragile egos all intertwining in ways that complicated every choice I made. At one point, my former boss pulled me aside. His tone was quieter, almost vulnerable. "I don't know how you do it," he admitted. "We thought we could manage, but we were wrong. I don't know if we can recover without you." I looked at him, really looked, and I realized that this was a turning point not just for the company, but for me. I had been underestimated, dismissed, and yet here I was, the linchpin everyone depended on. The irony was stark, almost bitter. As the hours dragged on, the crises compounded. Another critical project ran into a snag. Key staff members argued about solutions, unsure whom to follow. Clients were sending messages that hinted at lost trust. And through it all, my former boss oscillated between trying to assert control and deferring entirely to my guidance. The tension in the room was almost physical. Every conversation, every decision carried weight, and it felt like the entire company was teetering on the edge. Late in the evening, after hours of intense troubleshooting, I stepped back for a moment and surveyed the chaos. I could see the human cost, exhausted colleagues, frazzled staff, worried clients, and a boss who, despite his pleas, had lost the confidence he once carried. I realized how fragile the balance had been all along, how quickly things could tip in one direction or another. And yet, despite the pressure, despite the frustration, despite the anger at how I had been treated, I felt a strange sense of clarity. Something was coming. I could feel it. The tension was reaching a breaking point. One more misstep, one more overlooked detail, and the company could be facing consequences that were impossible to undo. But at the same time, the opportunity to make a real impact, the chance to prove my expertise, my value, my judgment, was right in front of me. The stakes had never been higher, and the next hours would define everything. I glanced at my phone. Another call from the client. Another message from my boss. The weight of responsibility pressed down on me, but I couldn't look away. Every instinct, every lesson, every ounce of experience screamed that this was the moment that would determine not just the company's fate, but mine as well. And in that moment, I realized the full gravity of the situation. After 17 years of being dismissed, undervalued, and labeled too expensive, I was now the only person who could prevent a disaster. The irony was almost unbearable, but it didn't matter. What mattered was what I would do next, and how the events of this night would play out. I took a deep breath, prepared myself, and stepped back into the fray. Every choice, every decision, every word mattered now. The tension was at its peak, the stakes higher than ever, and the moment of truth was just around the corner. And that's when it happened. A new problem appeared, one bigger than anything before, one that would test every skill, every ounce of patience, and every decision I had made in my career. I froze for a second, realizing that the climax of everything was about to hit, and the outcome was uncertain. Every heartbeat echoed in my ears as I prepared for the next move, knowing that this night could change everything. Just when I thought I had a handle on the situation, my phone buzzed with an unexpected message that made my stomach drop. It was from the operations team, an internal alert I hadn't anticipated. One of the company's biggest projects, the one that had been running relatively smoothly despite everything else, had suddenly gone off track. But it wasn't just a minor hiccup. It looked like a major system failure that could potentially cost the company millions. My pulse quickened as I scanned the details. Something about it didn't make sense. The system should have been stable. It had been tested, monitored, and double-checked. I rushed to the room where the team was trying to contain the problem. Faces were tense, eyes wide with anxiety. I could feel the fear in the air. People were exhausted, uncertain, and now panicked. "This shouldn't be happening," I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. But as I dug into the system, reviewing logs and cross-checking the data, a chilling realization hit me. This wasn't an accident or a simple oversight. Someone had interfered with the system. The room went silent as I shared my discovery. Colleagues exchanged glances, disbelief written across their faces. My former boss froze, staring at the screen, his confident demeanor gone entirely. "What do you mean someone interfered?" he asked, his voice tight. I explained what I had found, subtle changes to the system's configuration, unauthorized modifications that weren't part of any approved plan. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing and had a motive I couldn't yet understand. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The stakes had escalated far beyond technical issues or internal inefficiency. This was no longer just about missing deadlines or slipping projects. It was about sabotage, about someone within the company actively undermining its operations. The tension in the room skyrocketed. Trust, already fragile, began to fracture. Eyes darted toward one another, suspicion hanging heavy in the air. I felt a mix of adrenaline and frustration. After 17 years of building and safeguarding these systems, to have someone deliberately compromise them felt almost personal. I knew I had to act fast, but I also knew that solving the technical problem was only part of the challenge. The human element, the hidden agendas, the politics, the fear of being blamed, was now a critical factor. As I coordinated with the team to stabilize the system, another twist emerged. An email appeared in my inbox from an external source, a major client, the one who had been quietly escalating complaints. The tone was urgent, bordering on accusatory. They had noticed the anomalies too, and they were considering taking their business elsewhere. The pressure intensified. The client's trust, which had been carefully cultivated over years, was now at risk. One wrong move, and the reputation of the company and my own professional standing could be permanently damaged. I realized something else that made my chest tighten. The sabotage wasn't random. Whoever had done this had knowledge of my systems, insight into how I designed them, and likely an agenda tied to the recent changes in leadership. This wasn't just incompetence, it was intentional, strategic, and potentially destructive. And now, I had to figure out not just how to fix it, but why it had happened and who was behind it. Meanwhile, my former boss grew increasingly anxious. His earlier confidence had completely vanished, replaced by frantic attempts to regain control. Every decision he made now seemed reactive, hasty, and uncertain. I could see that he understood, at least subconsciously, that the company was in deeper trouble than anyone had admitted. And yet, he still expected me to take the lead, to untangle a web that was part technical, part human, and entirely volatile. As I worked late into the night, the tension inside the office reached a breaking point. Staff members were arguing over priorities, some defensive, some panicked. One colleague, a senior engineer who had always been ambitious, suggested a risky workaround to fix the system quickly. I paused, weighing the implications. If it failed, the fallout could be catastrophic. But doing nothing wasn't an option either. Every decision felt like a tightrope walk over a pit of consequences. Then came the final twist of the night. As I traced the source of the sabotage, I discovered that the interference wasn't limited to just one system. Multiple projects had been compromised in ways that were designed to look like accidents. Someone had orchestrated this meticulously, with knowledge that only a few insiders could possess. My mind raced. Could it be someone still within the company? Or was it an external actor with access to our systems? Either way, the stakes had escalated beyond anything I had prepared for. I looked around the office, exhausted, frustrated, but fully alert. The human drama was as intense as the technical crisis. Suspicion, fear, and desperation were now as dangerous as any failing system. And amidst it all, my former boss looked to me with a mixture of hope, guilt, and sheer reliance. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same person who had dismissed me for being too expensive now depended on me completely, but the situation had grown far more complicated than anyone had imagined. I knew one thing: the coming hours would define everything. This wasn't just about salvaging projects or appeasing clients anymore. It was about uncovering the truth, protecting the company, and navigating a maze of human ambition, hidden motives, and high-stakes pressure. Every decision, every action, every word mattered, and one mistake could make the difference between recovery and disaster. And as I stared at the screens, tracking anomalies, following digital breadcrumbs, and coordinating frantic teams, I realized the night was far from over. The climax was approaching, and the tension had reached its peak. The mystery of who had sabotaged the company, why it had happened, and whether I could fix it all without being pulled under with it remained unsolved. Somewhere deep in the chaos, I felt the pulse of anticipation, not just mine but everyone's. The employees, the clients, the leadership, all were holding their breath, unknowingly waiting to see whether the tide could be turned or whether the collapse I feared was inevitable. The next move, the next discovery, the next revelation could change everything. And in that moment, as the clock ticked past midnight, I knew this was no longer just a story about being fired for being too expensive or even being begged for help afterward. This had become a story about survival, about power, about trust, and about the unexpected twists life throws at you when you least expect them. The next revelation, I realized, would change everything. The room was tense, almost suffocating. Every team member was watching my every move, the hum of machines, the flashes of red alerts on screens, and the low murmur of urgent conversation blending into a pressure I could almost touch. I knew the moment had arrived. This was the point where everything, years of work, trust, loyalty, and tension would collide. I traced the sabotage to its source, a discovery that shocked me. It wasn't an external hacker, as I had feared, but someone internal, a senior team member I had trusted and mentored over the years. The evidence was undeniable: unauthorized changes, careful manipulation, and subtle interference in multiple systems. It was calculated, deliberate, and yet, inexplicably, driven by fear rather than malice. I confronted them quietly in a corner of the office. Their eyes widened, a mixture of guilt and panic. I didn't mean for it to get this bad, they stammered. They admitted they had been trying to cover up a mistake from weeks ago, thinking that tweaking the system quietly would prevent anyone from noticing. But it had backfired, and now the company was on the brink. I felt a mix of frustration and empathy. Years of loyalty had given me the perspective to see this not just as sabotage, but as desperation, as someone trying to avoid blame in a system that had long relied too heavily on a few key people. I calmly explained what needed to be done: restoring the systems, undoing the unauthorized changes, and implementing safeguards so this could never happen again. Back at the control panels, I coordinated every step. The team worked frantically, following my instructions. Colleagues who had been tense and doubtful earlier now moved with precision, their confidence slowly returning as they realized we were regaining control. My former boss watched, silent, a mixture of relief and guilt crossing his face. He finally spoke, voice tight. I had no idea how much this all relied on you. I was wrong. For a moment, I let myself feel a strange satisfaction. The irony wasn't lost. After 17 years of being dismissed for being too expensive, I was the linchpin preventing a total collapse. I was proving, not just to them, but to myself, the value of experience, dedication, and expertise. The systems began stabilizing, errors disappearing, and client complaints gradually paused as communications clarified and projects got back on track. Staff exhaled collectively, a shared sense of relief rippling through the office. The tension, while still present, had shifted from panic to cautious hope. Just when I thought the crisis was resolved, a new alert flashed. A client data file, critical to ongoing contracts, had been corrupted during the sabotage. If not recovered immediately, months of work could be lost. My pulse quickened. I dove in, analyzing backups, tracing every change. Hours of technical finesse and careful reconstruction followed, my experience guiding the team. Slowly, painstakingly, the file was restored. The sighs of relief were audible, but the weight of the moment lingered. We had narrowly avoided disaster. In the aftermath, I gathered the team, including my former boss. We went over what had happened, the risks, the mistakes, and the lessons. The company had survived, but the lesson was clear. People, not just processes, determined success. Trust, communication, and respect were as critical as technical skill. I realized that my departure had exposed vulnerabilities that couldn't be fixed with expertise alone. They required culture, leadership, and accountability. As things seemed to settle, my former boss approached me with a tentative question. "Will you stay and help rebuild for good this time?" I looked at him, at the team, at the systems we had just saved. It would have been easy to say yes, but the experience had taught me a deeper lesson. Loyalty and respect can't be demanded, they must be earned. I smiled faintly. "I can help," I said carefully, but on my terms. There was pause, a moment of silent acknowledgement that the balance of power had shifted. For the first time, I felt control not just over systems, but over my own professional future. And then came the final twist, one I hadn't anticipated. As I was reviewing logs one last time, I noticed something strange, a pattern of irregular activity in a different part of the network, subtle, almost invisible. Someone else had been observing the systems during the crisis, someone external, someone who had stayed hidden. The implications hit me instantly. While we had resolved the immediate threat, a new danger lingered, potentially more dangerous than anything before. I stared at the screen, adrenaline surging. The crisis had ended, for now, but the story wasn't over. The company had survived, mistakes were corrected, trust partially restored, and lessons learned. Yet, the shadow of uncertainty remained. A new challenge loomed, unseen and unpredictable, waiting for the right or wrong moment to strike. I leaned back, exhausted but alert, understanding that my role wasn't over. The stakes were higher than ever, and the responsibility, the tension, and the challenge were far from gone. And somewhere in the quiet hum of the office, I realized the truth. Being dismissed for being too expensive had been only the beginning. The real test of skill, patience, and resilience was just beginning, and the next twist could come at any moment. The morning after the crisis, the office felt different. The tension that had gripped every hallway, every room, every conversation for weeks had eased, replaced by a quiet, almost fragile calm. People moved with purpose again, but there was a noticeable shift, a subtle respect, an understanding that things could never go back to exactly how they were before. I walked through the rooms, nodding to colleagues, seeing the exhaustion in their faces but also a renewed sense of determination. The company had survived, yes, but it had survived because people were willing to adapt, to learn, and to trust each other, and for a moment, to trust me. I met with my former boss first. There was no pomp, no grand gesture, just a simple conversation. "I owe you an apology," he said, eyes sincere. "I didn't value your contributions the way I should have. We let pride and cost-cutting blind us to the real value you brought to this company." I nodded, accepting the apology but knowing that forgiveness, like trust, had to be earned, not assumed. I also understood that leadership isn't just about admitting mistakes, it's about change, about ensuring that lessons are applied and repeated errors are avoided. The senior engineer who had caused the sabotage approached me as well. He was humbled, anxious, but willing to learn. "I see now how much we relied on you," he said quietly. "I wanted to fix things without anyone knowing, but I realized now it only made things worse." I reassured him, explaining that mistakes happen, but owning them, learning from them, and seeking guidance is what truly matters. There was relief in his expression, a hint of a new beginning, and I could tell he would approach his work differently moving forward. As the day unfolded, I spent time with other team members, checking systems, offering guidance, and observing how they interacted. There was a noticeable difference. People were communicating more openly, asking questions when uncertain, and supporting one another. What had once been a reactive, tense environment was slowly becoming proactive, collaborative. I realized that one of the biggest takeaways from the crisis wasn't about technical fixes, it was about culture. Systems can fail, processes can break down, but people, when guided and empowered, can rebuild almost anything. Emails from clients continued to come in, but their tone had shifted. Instead of frustration or threats, there were acknowledgments of the improvements we had made, expressions of appreciation for the swift response, and cautious optimism that projects would now move forward without further disruption. It was a reminder that professional reputation, like trust, is fragile, but recoverable when actions are decisive, transparent, and accountable. Later, I met with the external client who had initially tipped me off to anomalies during the crisis. Their gratitude was evident. "You saved us," they said simply. "Not just the company, but our confidence in it." I smiled, realizing that the ripple effects of our work extended far beyond internal operations. Every project, every system, every decision mattered, not just for profit, but for people, relationships, and integrity. That realization grounded me, reminding me why I had dedicated 17 years of my life to engineering, problem-solving, and mentoring others. By mid-afternoon, the systems were fully stabilized. Projects were back on track, and teams were beginning to regain their rhythm. I stepped back for a moment, taking in the scene. It wasn't perfect. There were still gaps, lingering questions, and small issues to address, but the crisis had passed. What had once felt overwhelming, almost insurmountable, had been managed through skill, patience, and collaboration. And in that, I found a quiet satisfaction. Even so, the shadow of the final twist, the subtle signs of external observation I had noticed, remained in my mind. It reminded me that vigilance is always necessary, that success is never guaranteed, and that leadership and expertise aren't just about fixing problems after they occur, they're about anticipating challenges before they appear. I decided to implement new monitoring systems and protocols, not as punishment or control, but as safeguards to protect the company, the employees, and the clients. It was proactive, preventive, and importantly, empowering for the team. That evening, I finally sat down with my former boss to discuss the future. "I don't want to make the same mistakes," he said earnestly. "I want to rebuild this company in a way that values people like you, that trusts expertise, and that encourages collaboration over hierarchy. Will you help us?" I considered the offer carefully. The decision wasn't just about returning to a job or reclaiming authority. It was about principles, about ensuring that respect, recognition, and fairness were embedded in the company's culture going forward. I finally smiled. "I'll help," I said. "But this time, it has to be on terms that protect the people, the systems, and the processes we've built. And everyone has to understand that expertise isn't a cost, it's an investment." He nodded, understanding not just my words, but the deeper meaning behind them. There was no celebration, no fanfare, just the quiet acknowledgement that lessons had been learned and that the next chapter was beginning. In the days that followed, the company slowly recovered. Staff morale improved, projects resumed at a steady pace, and clients regained confidence. The sabotage issue became a teaching moment, reminding everyone of the importance of transparency, communication, and shared responsibility. And as for me, I found a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't just solving technical problems. I was shaping a culture, mentoring a team, and ensuring that the mistakes of the past wouldn't repeat themselves. Looking back, the experience taught me several critical lessons. First, expertise and experience are invaluable, but only when recognized and respected. Being too expensive isn't about money, it's about understanding true value. Second, crises often reveal weaknesses we don't see during routine operations, and leadership is defined by how challenges are navigated, not just by avoiding mistakes. Third, human factors, trust, communication, loyalty, matter as much as technical skills. And finally, resilience isn't just about enduring hardship, it's about learning from it, applying those lessons, and emerging stronger than before. I also reflected on the irony of the journey. Being dismissed after 17 years for being too expensive felt like an ending at first. But it became a turning point, a moment that revealed the true strength of experience, the fragility of systems without guidance, and the importance of standing firm in one's worth. And while the final twist had reminded me that challenges never truly end, it also gave me the confidence to face the unknown with clarity, strategy, and courage. As I left the office that evening, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the building. I walked slowly, thinking about the journey, about mistakes, lessons, trust, and redemption. The company had survived, the team had grown stronger, and I had reclaimed not just my professional value, but my sense of purpose. There was still work to do, challenges ahead, and the occasional uncertainty, but I knew that this time, the foundation was solid. And in the quiet of that moment, I realized the most important takeaway of all: respect, expertise, and dedication cannot be measured by cost alone. True value is recognized when it becomes indispensable, when it shapes outcomes, and when it strengthens people, teams, and organizations. The journey had been difficult, dramatic, and unexpected, but it had taught lessons that would stay with me forever. The story that began with being dismissed for being too expensive had ended with a deeper understanding. Sometimes, the greatest challenges reveal not just weaknesses, but strengths, not just mistakes, but lessons, and not just endings, but new beginnings. And as I looked toward the future, I knew one thing for certain: no challenge, no sabotage, and no mistake could ever diminish the value of experience, dedication, and integrity.